Hi girls, it's so good to see you. Wish we were doing this in person. Wish we just finished an awesome day of girls camp, but I hope everybody's doing well and I hope you're enjoying working on your camp bingo. So here we go with our traditional camp bedtime story, The Ordinary Princess. So part 1, How It Began. Long and long ago, when Oberon was king of the fairies, there reigned over the fair country of Phantasmagoria a monarch who had 6 beautiful daughters. They were in every way all that real princesses should be, for their hair was as yellow as the gold that is mined by the little gnomes in the mountains of the north. Their eyes were as blue as the larkspurs in the palace gardens, and they had complexions like wild rose petals and cream. Their royal mamma, the queen, was very proud of them, and they had all had extremely grand christenings when they were babies. She had called them after precious stones and had often referred to them playfully as my jewels. Their names were Diamond, Opal, Emerald, Sapphire, Crystal, and Pearl. Every princess wore a golden crown set with the jewels of her first name, so you can't imagine the excitement in the city of Fanf, which is the capital of Phantasmagoria, when the news leaked out that the goldsmiths and silversmiths, by appointment to His Royal Majesty King Hildebrand, had been commissioned to make another crown, and this time to set it with amethysts. "Oh, so there's going to be a 7th princess at the palace," exclaimed the housewives of Fanf. "Oh, that is as it should be. A 7th daughter is always lucky," said the oldest inhabitant. "Oh, 7th princess," said the romantic maidens, "and of course she will be the most beautiful of all. Youngest princesses always are. Oh, how lucky she will be. And oh, how lovely to be a princess," thought the school children, looking enviously across the roofs of the town to where the tall towers and pointed turrets of the royal palace of Fanf rose high against the treetops. "How do you know it won't be a prince this time?" asked the travelers, stopping at the inns and taverns of the city. But the townspeople and innkeepers and hosts of the tavern only laughed and said, "It is plain that you are strangers to our country. Our royal family always has princesses." "But you have a king," objected the travelers. "Ah, yes, but by tradition the heir to the throne is always the youngest son of the eldest princess. It's very simple." And so, on a lovely spring morning, when the primroses were gold in the forest afar away, and the woods were white with wild cherry blossoms, the great bronze cannon on the palace walls, which is only fired at the birth of a royal baby, boomed out upon the still air. And as the first puff of smoke broke from the walls and the first boom rang out over the city, the townspeople stopped their work, and their housewives and the shopkeepers and the school children all ran together into the streets. Every eye was turned towards the palace. Boom rang out the cannon. Boom! Boom! 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, counted the townsfolk. 20! A princess! They cried, and they threw their hats in the air and cheered, while the bells of all the churches in the city rang a merry peal, and a general holiday was declared in honor of the occasion. In a rich and splendid room high above in the turret of the palace, the cause of all the excitement and rejoicing lay in a golden cradle and blinked at the carved ceiling. Oh, the 7th princess really was the loveliest baby imaginable. She was no bigger than one of her sister's dolls, but she was as pink and white and gold as the apple blossoms in the spring sunshine, and her eyes were as blue as the sky above the forest far away. Her nurses and ladies in waiting never tired of admiring and exclaiming over her many perfections, and from the first she was a very good-tempered baby. She never cried or screamed, but would lie on her back and smile at the sunbeams dancing on the ceiling, or sleep for hours on end. Oh, she had a very grand nursery for such a very small person. The ceiling was all carved and painted with legends of the forest far away, and the walls were hung with amethyst-colored tapestry. The floor was spread with silken carpets, and the seventh princess had no less than 12 attendants all her own. There was her nurse Marta, and 3 under-nurses, 2 ladies-in-waiting, 4 nursery maids, and 2 pages. Sometimes the pages would play on flutes and violins, while the ladies-in-waiting sang lullabies to hush the seventh princess to sleep. When she was 6 years old, preparations were begun for an especially grand and splendid christening. Hundreds of clerks sat at ivory desks all day writing out invitations with gold ink on parchment. Hundreds of pages heated gold sealing wax to seal the envelopes, and hundreds of the king's messengers put spurs to their horses and rode away east and west and north and south to deliver them to the invited guests. The list of invitations was so long that it took the Lord High Chamberlain from breakfast until supper time to read it, while the roll it made was so large that it took 6 men-at-arms to carry it. There had been a long debate in the council on the advisability of inviting fairies to the christening. The king had been against it from the first, but he ended up being overruled by the queen, who had been backed by the prime minister and the Lord High Chamberlain and a large majority of councillors. "Oh, all right," said the king. "Have it your way, but mind you, I think it's rash, and I shall go on saying that it's rash. We didn't have any of those fairy nuisances at the christenings of my other daughters, and what happened?" "Nothing," said the queen. "Precisely," said the king. "Perfect peace and quiet. Everything went off beautifully. No fuss, no bother, and everybody had a extremely good time." "But your majesty," began the grave prime minister. I know. Don't interrupt me," said the king testily. "You're going to tell me that it's the custom of our kingdom to invite fairies to the christening of a 7th daughter. You've at least said it 7 times, and I still say it's rash." "Oh, there's no need to get heated about it, dear," said the queen. "You know perfectly well that it has always been done before, and it would look very odd if it was not done now." "I am not getting heated," said the king. "I only said that it was rash." Here is a picture of the king and queen. "Oh, for goodness sakes, Hildebrand," snapped the queen, almost losing her royal temper. "Do stop using that annoying word." She took a deep breath and recovered her queenly calm. "Besides, dear, think how useful it will be. Fairies always give such delightful presents, like good temper and unfailing charm and unfading beauty. You wouldn't want to deprive your daughter of such a chance." "I can only repeat," said the king stubbornly, "that inviting fairies to a christening is asking for trouble, and getting it," he said gloomily. "Speaking for myself," said the king, "I'd rather far ask for several man-eating tigers. You may have forgotten what happened to my great-great-grandmother, but I have not. Had to sleep for 100 years, poor girl, and the entire court with her, all because of some silly fairy business at the christening." "But your majesty forgets," said the prime minister, "that unfortunate episode you referred to was due to gross neglect and carelessness. History tells us that an influential fairy was not invited. But on this occasion, I personally will take the greatest possible care that no calamity occurs like that again." And the prime minister tried to look very uncareless indeed. The Lord High Chamberlain hastened to add that no single member of King Oberon's court would be omitted from the list of guests. "And we must not forget," he pointed out, "that as Her Majesty has said, these persons have it in your power to bestow the most valuable of gifts for your daughter's sake," urged the Lord High Chamberlain. "Oh, all right," said the king peevishly. "Don't let's go over that again. But you mark my words," he said, "I'd much rather have a nice silver-plated christening mug from some nice solid baron than some chancy thing like unfading beauty from a tricky creature with wings and a wand." Besides, said the king, who's to tell that some tiresome fairy won't get on the wrong side of the bed and give my daughter perpetual bad temper instead? Answer me that. Oh, really, Hildebrand, said the queen in an exasperated sort of voice. I find you quite impossible at times. It seems to me that you are determined to be unreasonable about the whole affair. But your majesty, began the prime minister. But your majesty, began the Lord High Chamberlain. But your majesty, chorused the councillors. Oh, all right, said the king. Have it your own way. Ask the lot. Don't mind me. He gathered up his train and glared at his councillors and the prime minister and Lord High Chamberlain and the queen. But don't say I didn't warn you, he said. No fairies have ever attended a christening where there hasn't been some funny business happening somewhere. You just mark my words. It's rash. And with that, he bounced out of the council chamber and slammed the door behind him. So the fairies were invited after all, and the most tremendous care was taken that no fairy should be overlooked. In fact, a special committee was appointed to see that no one was forgotten. As the day of the christening approached, the whole palace buzzed with bustle and excitement like a hive of bees. In the royal kitchen, 220 cooks, 400 scullions, and as many servicemen, and 500 kitchen maids worked like mad, baking cakes and pies and pastries. They stuffed swans and peacocks and boar's heads and made wonderful sweets, marzipan trees hung with crystallized cherries, and castles and dragons and great ships of sugar candy. 5 cooks from Italy worked on the christening cake, which was decorated with hundreds of sugar bells and crystallized roses, and was so tall that they had to stand on silver stepladders to ice it. Ladies in waiting filled golden flower vases and crystal bowls filled with hundreds of blooms, so that the whole palace looked like a flower garden and smelled most deliciously of roses and lilies and lilacs. Housemaids polished the chandeliers, and footmen and pages ran to and fro with trays full of china and glass. In the city, the rich merchants and important citizens who had been invited to the ceremony were having new suits and dresses made for the occasion, and the townsfolk were preparing bonfires and decorating their streets and houses with banners and wreaths. The day of the christening dawned bright and sunny, with not a single cloud in the blue sky. Guns boomed and church bells rang in every steeple as the townsfolk crowded around the palace to cheer the arrival of the guests. But the 7th princess was quite unbothered by all this noise and fuss. She lay in her magnificent cradle in the great throne room and stared at the dangling fringe of the little golden bells on the canopy above her head, and paid no attention to the guests at all. She had 7 godfathers and 17 godmothers, and when the christening ceremony was over, heralds in scarlet and gold blew a fanfare on silver trumpets and announced her 7 names to the populace. Her Serene and Royal Highness, the Princess Amethyst, Alexandra, Augusta, Araminta, Adelaide, Aurelia, Anne, cried the heralds. Then the people cheered and flung their hats into the air, and 1,000 white doves were released from the windows of the palace. The doves flew out into the sunshine and circled and cooed above the tall turrets and battlements before winging their way into the forest of far away. While inside the throne room, the guests passed in procession by the cradle, each in turn presenting a christening gift to the 7th princess. The presents mounted up in a huge pile until they almost reached the ceiling, but the gifts that the fairies took up no room at all. For the sort of presents they gave did not need to be packed in boxes. They gave the 7th princess charm and wit and grace and courage and a great many other things like that, and the queen couldn't help looking a little pleased with herself and saying in a rather large whisper to the king, "You see, it has all turned out to be a great success in spite of all your fussing. I told you so." But the king only sniffed. "I wouldn't speak too soon," he said pessimistically. "There's still a lot of time for something nasty to happen." And just then, something did. The last and most important of all the fairy godmothers have arrived late because of a traffic jam on her road to the palace. Her name was Crustacea, and she was the fairy in charge of water, which means she was the head fairy of all the seas, pools, ponds, lakes, and rivers. So here is a picture of the fairy Crustacea. She was very old and rather deaf, and her temper was always inclined to be a little uncertain when she was on dry land. But for all that, she was very important and a powerful lady, and the guests made way for her as she hobbled up to the cradle. The queen bowed most graciously to her, and the king muttered something about being pleased to see her, while the old fairy peered at them over the top of her horn-rimmed spectacles. "I wish," said the old fairy crossly, "that people who give large parties would take trouble to see that the traffic is properly controlled. Your police appear to be quite useless. Would you believe it? I was held up in a crush of carriages for over half an hour. Me, at my age. Oh, I cannot endure dust, and I am almost as dry as a bone." And indeed, her long seaweedy robe was hardly damp, and instead of nice and sea-watery, she liked it. The queen was full of apologies and sent at once for a bowl of salt water from the royal fish ponds. Old Crustacea poured out some over herself and drank the rest, and said she felt better. The water trickled down from her seaweedy robe and made messy pools on the polished floor, but nobody liked to mention it. "And now," said the fairy Crustacea, "let's take a look at this brat of yours." She hobbled to the cradle, peered down at the seventh princess. The seventh princess had been snoozing, but she opened one blue eye and then the other, and she smiled at the old fairy. Old Crustacea put a long bony finger and touched the seventh princess's pink cheek. Then she looked at the king and the queen and their splendid guests and the 6 little sister princesses, each more beautiful than the last. And finally she looked at the huge pile of glittering presents and the list that the Lord High Chamberlain had made of the gifts bestowed by the other fairies. Said the fairy Crustacea. "Wit, charm, courage, health, wisdom, grace. Good gracious, poor child. Well, thank goodness my magic is stronger than anybody else's." She raised her twisty coral stick, waved it 3 times over the cradle of the 7th princess. "My child," said the fairy Crustacea, "I am going to give you something that will probably bring you more happiness than all these fa-la-las and fripperies put together. You shall be ordinary." And nodding her head briskly, the fairy Crustacea turned away and hobbled rapidly out of the throne room, leaving her twisty coral stick leaning on her twisty coral stick and leaving a faint smell of seaweed and damp track on the polished floor behind her. For quite a minute after she was gone, there was stunned silence in the red and gold throne room of the palace. It was broken by the king. "I told you so! I told you so!" said the king triumphantly. "Rash!" said the king. "I knew it was rash. Didn't I say something like this was bound to happen?" Oh, words cannot describe the scene that followed. The queen wept, and the king went on saying, "Rash, and I told you so," until the prime minister felt like resigning on the spot. Everybody spoke at once. Words like, "Oh, impossible," and "horrors," and "disgraceful" flew in all directions, and the noise became so great that you could hardly hear yourself think. It was then that the 7th princess proceeded to show how quickly the fairy Crustacea's gift had worked. She screwed up her apple blossom face into something resembling a small squished tomato, and opening her mouth as wide as possible, she screamed and screamed as any ordinary baby would have done after a tiring day. And with all that noise going on, everybody stopped talking at once and rushed forward to the cradle, but the 7th princess just kept right on screaming. She didn't like all those strangers. She was tired and bored and hungry, and she didn't care who knew it. "Yow!" screamed the 7th princess, doubling her small pink fists and turning quite purple in the face. The queen fainted away and had to be revived with smelling salts. The king said, "I told you it was rash," for the 17th time, And the Prime Minister resigned on the spot, while the Lord High Chamberlain sent half a dozen gentlemen in waiting, hurrying after the fairy Crustacea to beg her to please come back and change her mind. But alas, by the time the panting messengers reached the gates, the fairy Crustacea was gone. So that was that. The christening party broke up in confusion, and the guests said goodbye and how sorry they were. And perhaps it wouldn't turn out so bad after all. One must look on the bright side, mustn't one? The last coach of the last guest rumbled out of the palace yard, and the footmen and the pages and the serving men began to clear away the remnants of the feast. They took the leftover cakes and pastries and broken bits of marzipan trees, sugar candy castles and ships and dragons home to their friends and relations, while the Queen took to her bed in a state of nervous prostration, and the Prime Minister took to his with a headache. But as for her Serene and Royal Highness, the Princess Amethyst, Alexandra, Augusta, Araminta, Adelaide, Aurelia Anne of Phantasmarania, she was taken back to her royal nursery, still screaming as determinedly as ever. There's the picture. And that is the end of part 1. Love you, guys. See you tomorrow.